I really wanted to come up with a funny intro for this build, but I didn't want it to be gross, like something to do with pus or infestation, which basically got rid of half the ideas that I had for this intro. And I also didn't want it to have anything to do with butts, which is basically the other half of Saryn intro. So, hi. I'm a man on the internet, and this is a Saryn build. This is one of the few builds that I have that's hyper specialized and very niche, because I made it specifically to crush Elite Sanctuary Onslaught. Nothing more, nothing less. It doesn't work particularly well in normal missions, as the enemy density is simply too low, and it is not Steel Path viable. The defense on this build is not good enough to survive in Steel Path. It will, however, solo the first 8 zones of Elite Sanctuary Onslaught very reliably, and if you're good with it, you can push it up to 10 or even 12. It also doesn't use any crazy interactions, it doesn't really need arcanes or archon shards or anything like that, so it's a pretty straightforward setup that most people should be able to put together. Because if you don't have Umbra mods, just replace them with thermal mods. The same with primed continuity, you can just replace it with normal continuity, and if you don't have primed sure-footed, you can just replace it with handspring. But anyway, for the aura, we're gonna slap in energy siphon for a bit of energy generation, and we're either gonna run primed sure-footed or handspring in the Exilus to get rid of knockdowns or recover from them faster. Then we run primed continuity or regular continuity for a bit of extra duration, Augur Reach and Stretch for a bunch of range. This is good for miasma and spores, of course. Then we slap on adaptation for a bit of extra chunkiness, because the later waves of Elite Sanctuary Onslaught can hit quite hard. We follow that up with Streamline for a bit of ability efficiency, so our stuff is cheaper. And then I also like to run Revealing Spores. This is an augment for spores that gives you enemy radar, and it marks infected enemies on your minimap with a green triangle. This is more of a quality of life thing than anything else, so you don't necessarily need to run it, but I absolutely love it because it very quickly allows me to see how and where my spores are spreading on the minimap. And finally, to get some baseline tankiness, we run Umbral Fiber and Umbral Vitality for health and armor. Now, as you may have noticed, we are not running any extra power strength on this build, and that's deliberate, because with Saryn you have to be careful with how much damage you give her spores, because it's difficult to spread your spores when everything is dead. You might actually notice it with this build too if you stack your spore damage a little bit too high, like once you go up to about 1000, maybe 1200, the enemies will start dying really fast and you will have a hard time spreading your spores. Though that also depends on the faction. It's different when you're fighting the Infested than when you're fighting the Grenier. Now, the way the build works is pretty straightforward. You buff yourself with Toxic Lash, throw your spores on the enemy, and then pop them with whatever weapon you have. If you need more damage at any point, you can activate Miasma, and if things go south and you take a little bit too much damage, you can activate Maul to draw some of the enemy attention away from you. Now, I would personally recommend you use a melee weapon to pop the spores, because it's sometimes a little bit buggy when you're using a primary or a secondary, even with Toxic Lash, but also because you have access to healing return, which is absolutely fantastic with builds like this that proc a ton of status on the enemies. The amount of healing you can get from this mod is insane on this build. This is one of my favorite builds of all time. It's not the best build ever, but it is really good at what it does. So if you're having trouble with Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, or you just want to farm it on a fairly low effort setup, I would highly recommend you give this build a shot. And as always guys, I thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.